My wife invited her ex to be her +1 at her sister's wedding. He's practically family. You'll understand, she said. I smiled and replied, of course I understand. Then, secretly, I invited his wife to attend the wedding. When she walked in, the dinner became unforgettable. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I'm Thomas, and I'm 62 years old. I thought I knew what humiliation felt like after all these years of marriage, but nothing prepared me for that Tuesday morning when Margaret casually dropped a bomb that would shatter what little dignity I had left. I was sitting at our kitchen table reading the newspaper and sipping my coffee when she walked in wearing that floral robe I'd bought her for Christmas 3 years ago. She poured herself a cup of coffee with that deliberate slowness she always used when she was about to say something she knew would hurt me. Thomas, I need to tell you something about Sarah's wedding next month, she said, not even looking at me as she stirred sugar into her cup. Sarah was Margaret's younger sister, the one who'd always treated me like I was some sort of temporary fixture in Margaret's life. The wedding was supposed to be a big affair. 200 guests at the country club where Margaret's family had been members for generations. What about it? I asked, though something in her tone already made my stomach tighten. Margaret finally looked at me, and I saw that familiar expression, the one she wore when she was about to justify something she knew was wrong. Well, you know how they're allowing +1s for the family members? I nodded, wondering where this was heading. I've decided to invite David. The newspaper crinkled in my hands as my grip tightened. David, her ex-husband, the man she'd been married to for 8 years before she met me, the man whose name still made her eyes light up in ways mine never did. David, I managed to keep my voice steady, though my heart was already pounding. As your +1, he's practically family, Thomas. Sarah adores him, and he was so hurt when we divorced. This would mean a lot to him. She took a sip of her coffee as if she'd just mentioned the weather. You'll understand. Those 3 words, you'll understand, hit me like a physical blow. Not, I hope you'll understand, or please try to understand. Just a flat statement that I would accept this humiliation because that's what I always did. I stared at her. This woman I'd been married to for 15 years. This woman I'd supported through her mother's death, her job losses, her countless mood swings and cruel comments. She was 61 years old, with graying blonde hair that she had colored every 6 weeks, and hands that had grown soft from never having to work hard, because I'd always taken care of everything. Margaret, I said slowly, you want to take your ex-husband to your sister's wedding instead of me, your actual husband? She waved her hand dismissively. Don't be dramatic. It's not instead of you. You'll be there too, of course. You can sit with my cousin Patricia and her husband. The sting of that casual dismissal made my chest tight. I'd be relegated to sitting with the distant relatives while she paraded around with David, the love of her life who got away. What will people think? I asked, hating how weak my voice sounded. People will think I'm a mature woman who can maintain friendships with people from my past. Her tone was getting sharper now, the way it always did when I questioned her decisions. Besides, David and I have history. We understand each other in ways that... She trailed off, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. In ways that you and I never will, she might as well have said. I looked down at my coffee, watching the cream swirl in patterns that reminded me of everything spinning out of control. This wasn't the first time Margaret had made me feel like I was just a placeholder in her life. There was the time she forgot our anniversary, but remembered David's birthday. The time she kept his photo in her jewelry box, for sentimental reasons. The countless times she'd mentioned something funny David used to say, or how David would have handled a situation differently. But this was different. This was public humiliation on a scale I'd never experienced. Margaret, we're married, I said quietly. Married people go to weddings together. She let out a little laugh that made my skin crawl. Thomas, you're being possessive. It's not attractive at my age, and it's certainly not attractive at yours. There it was, another little cut, another reminder that I was older, less desirable, less everything than David. I was 62 to David's 58. I had gray hair and a slight paunch from too many years of Margaret's cooking and too few years of feeling motivated to take care of myself. David, from what I remembered, had stayed fit and handsome, probably because he'd never been married to someone who made him feel worthless. Fine, I said, folding my newspaper with deliberate calm. You're right, I understand completely. Margaret blinked, clearly surprised by my easy acceptance. She'd been prepared for a fight, for the usual pattern where I'd protest and she'd wear me down with guilt and manipulation until I gave in. But I didn't have the energy for that dance anymore. Really? She asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. Really? I stood up, carrying my coffee cup to the sink. David is practically family. It makes perfect sense. I could feel her watching me as I rinsed the cup, probably trying to figure out if this was some sort of trap. But there was no trap. There was just a 62-year-old man who had finally hit rock bottom and found something hard to stand on. Well, good, she said eventually. I'm glad you're being reasonable about this. Reasonable. As if there was anything reasonable about a wife choosing another man over her husband. As if there was anything reasonable about 15 years of marriage being so easily dismissed. I left the kitchen without another word, climbing the stairs to my small home office where I kept my computer and the few things that were still purely mine. Margaret didn't follow. She never did when I retreated. She was probably relieved that the conversation had gone so smoothly. I sat at my desk and stared out the window at the maple tree we'd planted when we first moved into this house, 15 years ago, full of hope that this marriage would be different from her first one. What a fool I'd been. But as I sat there, something cold and calculating began to form in my mind. Margaret thought she could humiliate me publicly, and I'd just accept it with my usual defeated silence. She thought she could parade David around like a prize while I sat in the corner with the other discarded husbands. She was wrong. For the first time in years, I smiled a real smile. Margaret wanted to play games. I could play games too. And I had a feeling she was about to learn that even the most patient man has his limits. The question wasn't whether I'd let her take David to the wedding. The question was what David's wife, Elena, would think about her husband's special invitation. The rage came in waves over the next few days. I'd be brushing my teeth or making breakfast, and suddenly the full weight of Margaret's betrayal would hit me like a physical blow. She was planning to humiliate me in front of her entire family, and she expected me to smile and accept it. But I kept my expression neutral whenever she was around. I even asked helpful questions about the wedding planning, which seemed to delight her. She'd found a new dress, navy blue with silver accents, and spent an hour showing me different jewelry options to go with it, as if I cared what she wore while she was on the arm of another man. David always loved me in blue, she mentioned casually while holding up a necklace to her throat in the bedroom mirror. Always. Present tense. As if their relationship had never really ended. I'm sure he'll appreciate it, I replied evenly, and she shot me a look of surprise at my lack of jealousy. What Margaret didn't know was that I'd been doing some research of my own. It started innocently enough. I was curious about David, wondering what kind of man could still hold such power over my wife after all these years. So I looked him up on social media, something I'd never bothered to do before. What I found was interesting. David Patterson, 58 years old, living in Portland, Oregon, still handsome in that casual way that some men manage to pull off as they age. But more importantly, David was married, very married, based on his profile pictures. His wife Elena was a petite brunette with kind eyes and a warm smile. They'd been married for 7 years, and from the looks of their photos, they seemed genuinely happy. I spent an evening scrolling through Elena's profile, feeling something I hadn't felt in years, sympathy for another person's situation. She posted pictures of homemade dinners, hiking trips with David, anniversaries celebrated with obvious joy. She had no idea that her husband was planning to attend a wedding as another woman's date. The more I learned about Elena, the angrier I became, not just at Margaret, but at David too. Here was a man with a loving wife, and he was willing to participate in this charade that would humiliate both of our spouses. What kind of person does that? On Thursday evening, Margaret was on the phone with Sarah, discussing seating arrangements for the reception. I could hear her from the kitchen, where I was pretending to read a magazine. "Oh, David and I will be fine anywhere," she was saying, her voice bright with anticipation. "We're just so excited to be there together. It'll be like old times." Like old times. The words made my jaw clench. "Thomas will be sitting with Patricia and Bob," she continued. "He's being so understanding about everything. I think he's finally learning to be less possessive." I gripped the magazine so hard it tore. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while Margaret slept peacefully beside me. She'd been in an unusually good mood all week, humming while she did household chores and spending extra time on her appearance. The prospect of spending an evening with David had energized her in a way our marriage never had. I thought about Elena, probably sleeping peacefully next to David, trusting him completely. I thought about myself, lying there like a fool while my wife planned to publicly choose another man over me. And I thought about how satisfying it would be to see the look on both David's and Margaret's faces when Elena showed up unexpectedly at the wedding. The idea had been forming all week, but it was that moment, listening to Margaret's contented breathing while my own heart hammered with humiliation, that I decided to act on it. The next morning, I waited until Margaret left for her hair appointment before making my move. I'd found Elena's work information on her social media profile. She was a physical therapist at a rehabilitation center in Portland. I crafted my approach carefully. I called the center and asked to speak with Elena Patterson about a potential treatment consultation for my wife. When she came to the phone, her voice was professional but warm. "Hello, this is Elena. How can I help you?" "Mrs. Patterson, my name is Thomas Mitchell. I'm calling about something rather delicate that involves your husband, David." There was a pause. "I'm sorry. What is this regarding?" I took a deep breath. "Mrs. Patterson, I believe your husband may be attending a wedding next month in Sacramento as another woman's date. I thought you should know." The silence that followed lasted so long I wondered if she'd hung up. "Excuse me?" Her voice was smaller now, uncertain. "My wife Margaret invited David to be her +1 at her sister's wedding. She's my wife, Mrs. Patterson. We've been married for 15 years, but she chose to invite your husband instead of me." That's not possible, but I could hear the doubt creeping into her voice. "The wedding is on Saturday, September 23rd, at the Rosewood Country Club in Sacramento. Margaret told me David was practically family and that I would understand." Elena was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was shaky. "David told me he was going to Sacramento for a business conference that weekend." "I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this," I said, and I meant it. "I just thought you deserved to know." "Why are you calling me? What do you want?" That was the question I'd been asking myself all week. What did I want? Justice? Revenge? Or just for someone else to feel as humiliated as I did? "I was thinking," I said carefully, "that it might be nice if you could attend the wedding too, as a surprise for David. I'm sure he'd be thrilled to see you there." Elena let out a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "You want me to crash a wedding?" "I want you to attend a wedding where your husband will be acting as another woman's date. What you do with that information is entirely up to you." I gave her the details, the time, the location, the fact that it was black tie optional. Then I hung up, my heart pounding with the enormity of what I'd just done. That evening, Margaret came home with her hair freshly styled and her nails done. She was practically glowing with anticipation. "Only 2 weeks until the wedding," she said, admiring herself in the hallway mirror. "I can't wait for you to see David again. You two always got along so well." I smiled and nodded, playing the part of the understanding husband. "I'm sure it'll be an unforgettable evening," and it would be, for all of us. That night, I lay in bed with a strange sense of calm I hadn't felt in months. Margaret might think she'd won, but she had no idea what was coming. In 2 weeks, at her sister's wedding, she was going to learn that actions have consequences, and David was going to discover that betraying one spouse is complicated enough, but betraying 2 spouses at the same time requires a level of juggling that even he might not be able to manage. I couldn't wait to see how it all played out. The morning of the wedding arrived with the kind of crisp September air that makes everything feel possible. I woke up early before Margaret and stood at our bedroom window watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. In a few hours, everything would change. Margaret had been in a state of barely contained excitement all week. She'd gotten a manicure, a pedicure, and had her makeup professionally done the day before. Her navy dress hung on the closet door like a banner of her anticipated triumph. She'd even bought new lingerie, though I doubted it was for my benefit. "Today's the day," she said when she finally woke up, stretching luxuriously in bed. "I can't believe Sarah's finally getting married, and David will be there." She said his name with the kind of reverence usually reserved for movie stars or heads of state. I was already dressed in my best suit, the charcoal gray one I'd worn to my father's funeral 3 years ago. It seemed appropriate somehow. "You look handsome," Margaret said, though her attention was already drifting to her dress. "David always said you cleaned up well." Even on the morning of her sister's wedding, she couldn't help but reference David's opinion about me. It was almost impressive, the way she could twist every conversation back to him. We arrived at the Rosewood Country Club at 4:30, an hour before the ceremony. The place was exactly what I'd expected from Margaret's family. All white columns and perfectly manicured lawns, the kind of old-money elegance that made people like me feel permanently out of place. Margaret was practically vibrating with nervous energy as we walked through the club's entrance. She kept checking her reflection in every available surface and adjusting her jewelry. I'd seen her excited before, but this was different. This was the excitement of a woman about to be reunited with the love of her life. "There's Sarah," Margaret said, spotting her sister near the bridal suite. Sarah looked radiant in her wedding gown, surrounded by bridesmaids and family members fussing over last-minute details. We made our way over to offer congratulations, and I watched Margaret slip seamlessly into her role as the supportive older sister. She hugged Sarah, complimented her dress, and made all the appropriate comments about what a beautiful day it was, but I could see her eyes scanning the crowd, looking for David. "Where's your friend?" Sarah asked Margaret with a knowing smile. "David, right? I'm so excited to see him again." "He should be here any minute," Margaret replied, glancing at her watch. "You know how he is about being fashionably late." I excused myself to get a drink from the bar, partly because I needed something to steady my nerves, and partly because I wanted to position myself where I could see the entrance. If Elena was coming, I wanted to see her arrival. The bartender, a young man with perfectly slicked hair, poured me a whiskey neat. I was taking my first sip when I heard Margaret's delighted squeal from across the room. "David!" I turned to see him walking through the entrance, and I had to admit he looked good. Still tall and lean, with silver hair that somehow made him look distinguished rather than old. He was wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary, and he moved with the easy confidence of a man who'd never had to question his place in the world. Margaret practically floated across the room to greet him. I watched as he kissed her cheek, letting his hand linger on her waist in a way that made my jaw tighten. They looked natural together, comfortable in a way that Margaret and I never had. "Thomas!" David called out when he spotted me, walking over with Margaret's arm looped through his. "Good to see you again, buddy." Buddy, as if we were old friends rather than the man whose wife he was stealing for the evening. "David," I replied, shaking his offered hand. "Margaret's been looking forward to this all week." "Haven't we all?" he said, smiling down at Margaret with obvious affection. "It's been too long since we've had a chance to catch up properly." Margaret beamed up at him. "We have so much to talk about. Remember that little restaurant we used to go to for our anniversary? They finally reopened after the renovation. Our anniversary, not their anniversary. They were divorced, but she was already talking like they were a couple again." "We should go there sometime," David said, and I saw Margaret's eyes light up with possibility. The ceremony was scheduled to start at 5:30, and guests were beginning to take their seats in the garden area that had been set up with white chairs and an archway covered in roses. I found my assigned seat next to Patricia and her husband Bob, just as Margaret had promised. From there I had a perfect view of Margaret and David sitting together in the third row, her hand resting possessively on his arm. I checked my watch. 5:25. If Elena was coming, she'd be cutting it close. The music started, and Sarah began her walk down the aisle on her father's arm. She looked beautiful, radiant with happiness, and for a moment I felt genuinely happy for her. This was supposed to be her perfect day, and I hoped what was about to happen wouldn't ruin it for her. The ceremony was lovely, traditional, and elegant. The minister spoke about love and commitment, about the sacred bond between husband and wife. I found myself watching Margaret and David instead of the bride and groom. They were whispering to each other, sharing private jokes and memories that excluded everyone else around them. "You may kiss the bride," the minister announced, and as Sarah and her new husband shared their first kiss as a married couple, I saw David lean over and whisper something in Margaret's ear that made her blush like a teenager. The guests erupted in applause, and people began standing and milling about, preparing to move to the cocktail hour. I was about to stand myself when I saw her. Elena Patterson was walking through the garden entrance, wearing a simple black dress and carrying a small clutch purse. She looked exactly like her photos, but in person there was something fragile about her, like a woman who'd been holding herself together through sheer force of will. I watched as she scanned the crowd, clearly looking for David. Her eyes found him just as he was helping Margaret out of her chair, his hand on the small of her back in a gesture that was unmistakably intimate. Elena went very still. David hadn't seen her yet. He was too busy being charmed by Margaret, who was laughing at something he'd said and touching his arm with familiar ease. But I saw the exact moment Elena registered what she was seeing, her husband playing the role of devoted companion to another woman. The color drained from Elena's face, but she didn't flee. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and began walking purposefully through the crowd toward David and Margaret. Margaret saw her first. I watched confusion cross her face as this unfamiliar woman approached them with obvious intent. David was still facing away, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to break over his head. "David," Elena said, her voice carrying clearly across the garden despite its quiet tone. He turned, and the expression that crossed his face was one I'll remember for the rest of my life. Pure, undiluted panic. Elena, he managed, his voice cracking slightly. What are you doing here? I could ask you the same thing, she replied, her gaze moving between David and Margaret. You told me you were at a business conference. Margaret's confusion was giving way to dawning realization. You're married? She asked David, her voice rising slightly. Elena, this isn't what it looks like, David started, but Elena cut him off with a bitter laugh. It looks like my husband is attending a wedding as another woman's date while telling me he's at a business conference. Please enlighten me about what it actually is. People were starting to notice the commotion. Conversations were stopping as guests turned to watch the drama unfolding in the middle of the garden. Sarah and her new husband were still greeting well-wishers near the altar, but I could see some of the wedding party looking over with concern. Margaret's face was flushed with embarrassment and anger. David, you told me you were separated. You said Elena understood your need for space. Separated? Elena's voice was getting louder now. Is that what you call our marriage? Because I certainly don't remember agreeing to any separation. David looked like a man caught between two fires, and I found myself almost feeling sorry for him. Almost. Ladies, please, he said, glancing around nervously at the growing audience. This is Sarah's wedding. We shouldn't make a scene. You should have thought of that before you decided to bring your mistress as your date. Elena shot back. Margaret gasped. Mistress? I am not his mistress. We have a history. We were married for 8 years. And I've been married to him for 7. Elena replied, which makes you the other woman. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. I could see her processing the reality of the situation, that she wasn't the great love making a triumphant return to David's life. She was just another woman he was cheating with. David, Margaret said, her voice shaking, tell her that what we have is special. Tell her about our connection. David's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He looked at Margaret, then at Elena, then at the crowd of wedding guests who were now openly staring at the spectacle. But I knew he wouldn't say anything. Men like David were experts at compartmentalizing their lies, but when those compartments collided, they had no idea how to handle it. That's when I decided it was time to add my own contribution to the chaos. I pulled out my phone and opened the voice recording app. I'd been recording conversations with Margaret for weeks, documenting her plans and her casual cruelty toward me. But the conversation I was about to play would change everything. Perhaps, I said, stepping forward into the circle of drama. This would be a good time to share what Margaret really thinks about these arrangements. Margaret's eyes widened in horror as she recognized my voice and then the phone in my hand. She knew exactly what I was about to do. Thomas, don't, she whispered, but it was too late. I pressed play, and Margaret's voice filled the garden, clear and damning. David understands me in ways Thomas never could. This wedding is just the beginning. Once David sees how good we still are together, he'll remember why he married me in the first place. Thomas is just convenient, a placeholder until something better comes along. The silence that followed was deafening. The silence after my recording ended felt like the pause between lightning and thunder. You know something devastating is about to follow. I watched as the words Margaret had spoken in private now echoed across the wedding reception, reaching not just Elena and David, but her entire family and 100 other guests. Margaret's face went through a series of expressions. Shock, horror, rage, and finally something that looked like the moment a person realizes they're falling, and there's nothing to grab onto. Thomas, she hissed, her voice barely controlled. How dare you record me without my permission? How dare I replied, surprised by how calm my own voice sounded. Margaret, you just spent the last week planning to humiliate me in public. I simply wanted to make sure everyone understood the full context of this situation. Elena was staring at Margaret with a mixture of disgust and pity. So you knew he was married? She said flatly. You knew, and you planned this anyway. It's not like that, Margaret started, but her voice lacked conviction. The recording had made it impossible to deny her intentions. David, meanwhile, looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. His face had gone pale, and he kept glancing toward the exit as if calculating how quickly he could escape. Elena, sweetheart, let me explain. Explain what? Elena cut him off. Explain how you told me you were at a business conference while you were actually planning to rekindle your relationship with your ex-wife. Explain how you've been lying to me for who knows how long. Patricia, my elderly table-mate, had made her way over to the group. Her face was set in the kind of stern expression that only a family matriarch could master. "Margaret Ann," she said, using Margaret's full name like she was a child who'd been caught stealing candy. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" Margaret turned to face her aunt, and I could see her struggling to regain some measure of control. "Patricia, this is between David and me. You wouldn't understand." "I understand perfectly," Patricia interrupted. "I understand that you brought your ex-husband to your sister's wedding while your current husband sits alone at a table in the corner. I understand that you've been carrying on some sort of affair with a married man. And I understand that you just humiliated yourself, your family, and your sister on her wedding day." Margaret's mother, Helen, had appeared as well, her face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Margaret, what is that man talking about? What recording?" Before Margaret could answer, David made his move. "Elena," he said urgently, grabbing his wife's arm. "We need to talk privately. This isn't the place." Elena jerked her arm away from him. "Don't touch me," she said, her voice like ice. "And don't tell me what we need to do. You've forfeited any right to make decisions about our relationship." "But honey," Elena's voice rose to a level that carried across the entire garden. "You call me honey while you're here with her? While you're planning your romantic reunion?" Margaret stepped forward, desperation creeping into her voice. "Elena, you have to understand. David and I have a connection that goes back decades. What you heard on that recording. Thomas is just jealous. He's always been jealous of what David and I shared." "Shared?" Elena laughed, but there was no humor in it. "What you shared was a marriage that ended in divorce. What David and I share is a current marriage, or at least it was until about 5 minutes ago." Sarah's new husband had finally noticed the commotion and was making his way over, looking concerned. "Is everything all right here? Margaret, is there some kind of problem?" Margaret turned to him with wild eyes. "Robert, this woman is making a scene at your wedding. David and I are here together as friends, and she's acting like a wife who just discovered her husband is cheating on her," Elena finished. "Because that's exactly what I am." Robert looked confused, glancing between David and Margaret. "I thought David was Margaret's guest. Margaret, didn't you say he was an old family friend?" "He is," Margaret insisted, but her voice was getting shriller. "We were married years ago, but we've remained close. There's nothing wrong with that." "There's nothing wrong with remaining friends with an ex," Patricia said coldly. "There's something very wrong with bringing him as your date to a family wedding while your husband sits alone, and there's something inexcusable about planning to use this wedding to seduce a married man." Margaret whirled on me, her face twisted with rage. "This is all your fault," she spat. "You couldn't just accept the situation with dignity." "You had to sabotage everything." "I didn't sabotage anything," I replied. "I simply invited Elena to attend the same event her husband was attending. If that caused problems, perhaps you should ask yourself why." Helen was shaking her head in disgust. "Margaret, how could you do this to Thomas? How could you do this to our family?" "Thomas doesn't care," Margaret said desperately. "He agreed to this. He said he understood." "Because you gave me no choice," I said quietly. "You told me I would understand, not asked if I would. You told me David was practically family and that I'd accept it. You never once considered how this would make me feel, or what it would do to our marriage." Elena was watching this exchange with growing anger. "So you both knew," she said to Margaret and David. "You both knew this would hurt your spouses, and you planned it anyway." David finally found his voice. "Elena, it wasn't supposed to be like this. Margaret and I. We just wanted to spend some time together, to see if there was still something there." The admission hit like a bomb. Margaret's face lit up with vindication. Finally, David was acknowledging their connection, but Elena's expression went beyond anger into something colder and more final. "To see if there was still something there," Elena repeated slowly, "while married to other people." "You don't understand," Margaret said to Elena, her voice taking on a pleading tone. "David and I, we never really got closure. Our divorce wasn't because we stopped loving each other. It was because of circumstances." "Stop," Elena said flatly. "Just stop talking. I don't want to hear about your great love story. I want to know how long this has been going on." David and Margaret exchanged a look that lasted just a second too long, and I saw Elena catch it. "How long?" she repeated, her voice dangerous. "Elena," David started. "How long have you been in contact with her?" David's silence was answer enough. Elena nodded slowly as if confirming something she'd suspected for a while. "I see," she said. So this wasn't just about one wedding. This has been an ongoing affair. It's not an affair, Margaret protested. We're not. We haven't. What would you call it then? Elena asked. When a married man maintains a secret relationship with his ex-wife and lies to his current wife about it. Sarah appeared at Robert's side, still in her wedding dress, looking distressed. What's going on? Why is everyone shouting? The sight of the bride seemed to deflate some of the anger in the group. This was supposed to be her perfect day, and we were turning it into a Jerry Springer episode. I'm sorry, Sarah, I said, meaning it. This got out of hand. Margaret grabbed the opportunity to redirect blame. Yes, it did get out of hand. Thomas decided to make a private family matter into a public spectacle. Private family matter? Elena's voice was incredulous. You brought my husband to a wedding as your date. In what universe is that private? Helen stepped forward, her face stern. Margaret, I think you need to leave. Take David and go work this out somewhere else. This is Sarah's day. I'm not going anywhere, Margaret said defiantly. David and I were invited to this wedding. We have every right to be here. Actually, I said, pulling out my phone again, there's something else you all should know. Margaret's eyes widened in terror. Thomas, no, please. But I was past the point of mercy. I scrolled to another recording, one I'd made just 3 days ago when Margaret thought I was napping on the couch. This is Margaret talking to David on the phone, I announced to the group. Then I pressed play. Margaret's voice filled the air again. After the wedding, we can tell them both. Elena will understand eventually. She's gotten 7 good years out of you, which is more than most wives get. And Thomas. Well, Thomas will be fine. He's used to disappointment by now. Besides, I'll let him keep the house if he doesn't make things difficult. The silence that followed was even more profound than before. Elena looked like she'd been slapped. David was staring at Margaret with something approaching horror. And Margaret. Margaret finally realized that her carefully constructed fantasy was crumbling around her. You were planning to leave me, Elena said to David, her voice barely above a whisper. Both of you were planning to end your marriages. Elena, it's not... David started. Don't, she said, holding up her hand. Just don't. I've heard enough. She turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Thank you, she said simply, for letting me know who I married. Then she walked away, leaving David standing there looking like a man who just watched his life explode. Margaret was staring after Elena with panic in her eyes, finally beginning to understand what she'd lost. Not just David, though that was clearly devastating to her, but her family's respect, her marriage, and quite possibly her entire future. David, she said desperately, we can still... But David was already backing away from her, shaking his head. No, Margaret. This is over. This is all over. And with that, he turned and followed Elena toward the exit, leaving Margaret standing alone in the middle of her sister's wedding, wearing her carefully chosen navy dress and the shattered remains of her dreams. In the aftermath of David's departure, Margaret stood frozen in the middle of the garden like a statue that had suddenly realized it was made of sand. The wedding guests who had gathered to witness the drama were slowly dispersing, some heading to the bar with wide eyes and whispered conversations, others pretending they hadn't just seen a woman's entire world collapse in real time. Sarah was crying now, her perfect wedding makeup streaking down her cheeks. Margaret, how could you do this to me? How could you ruin my wedding day? Margaret seemed to snap back to awareness at her sister's words. Sarah, I didn't mean for this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you. But you did, Sarah shot back, her voice breaking. You brought another woman's husband to my wedding and caused a scene that everyone will remember instead of my vows. My children's children are going to hear about the day Aunt Margaret had a public affair at Grandma's wedding. Robert put his arm around his new wife, shooting Margaret a look of pure disgust. I think you should leave, he said firmly. You've done enough damage. Margaret looked around desperately, searching for an ally, but found only cold faces and disappointed stares. Her mother Helen was shaking her head slowly, like she was looking at a stranger. Mom, Margaret pleaded, you know me. This isn't who I am. I made a mistake. Helen's voice was quiet, but filled with a sadness that seemed to age her before our eyes. No, Margaret. A mistake is forgetting to RSVP or wearing the wrong color dress. This is who you've chosen to be. Patricia stepped forward, her face set in stone. In 68 years I have never been so ashamed of a family member. Your grandmother would be rolling in her grave if she could see what you've done today. I fell in love, Margaret said desperately, as if that explained everything. People fall in love. It's not a crime. With a married man, Helen said sharply, while you're married to another man. And you plan to destroy 2 marriages for your own selfish desires. Margaret's composure finally cracked completely. You don't understand, any of you understand what it's like to be married to someone who doesn't truly see you, who doesn't appreciate you. Thomas is a good man, but he's not David. He's never been David. I felt something twist in my chest at her words. Even now, even after everything, she was still holding up David as the standard I could never meet. And what about Elena? I asked quietly. What about the woman who's been married to David for 7 years? What about her feelings? Margaret whirled on me, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. This is all your fault. You orchestrated this whole thing. You brought her here just to humiliate me. I brought her here so she could see what her husband was doing, I corrected. Just like I recorded our conversation so people could hear what you really thought about your marriage and your family. I didn't make you say those things, Margaret. I just made sure people heard them. Uncle George, Helen's brother, stepped forward. He was a quiet man who rarely spoke at family gatherings, but when he did, people listened. Margaret, in all my 73 years, I've never seen anyone treat their spouse with such casual cruelty. That recording, the way you talked about Thomas, it was inhuman. Margaret's face crumpled. You're all ganging up on me. None of you understand what I've been going through, what you've been going through. Patricia's voice was incredulous. You mean the burden of being married to a man who's supported you for 15 years? The terrible hardship of having a husband who's never raised his voice to you, never cheated on you, never given you anything but loyalty and respect? He's boring, Margaret burst out, the words tumbling from her lips like a confession she'd been holding back for years. He's safe and reliable and boring. David makes me feel alive in a way Thomas never has. The admission hung in the air like a slap. I'd known it, of course. I'd felt it in every interaction we'd had for years. But hearing her say it out loud, in front of our entire extended family, was like having a wound I'd been nursing in private suddenly exposed to daylight. Sarah looked at Margaret with something approaching horror. So you thought you'd fix your boredom by destroying 2 marriages at my wedding? It wasn't supposed to happen like this, Margaret said, her voice small and broken. David and I were going to be discreet. We were going to handle things properly. Properly? Helen's voice was sharp with disbelief. There is no proper way to have an affair, Margaret. It's not an affair if we're meant to be together, Margaret insisted, but even she seemed to realize how weak that sounded. David just walked away from you, I pointed out, in front of everyone. He chose his wife over you. How does that fit into your grand romantic narrative? Margaret's face went white. He was just shocked. He didn't expect Elena to show up. Once he has time to think. He ran, Patricia said bluntly. The moment things got difficult, he abandoned you, just like he's abandoning his wife. That's the man you threw away your marriage for. Margaret sank into one of the white wedding chairs, her carefully styled hair beginning to come undone, her perfect makeup smeared with tears. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked her age. More than her age. She looked like a woman who'd bet everything on a fantasy and lost. I need to find David, she said suddenly, standing up and looking around wildly. I need to explain to him that this wasn't my fault, that Thomas sabotaged everything. Margaret, stop, Helen said firmly. Just stop. Look around you. Look at what you've done to this family, to your sister's wedding, to your marriage. David is gone. He made his choice. But he loves me, Margaret said, her voice breaking. He told me he loves me. Men like David tell a lot of women they love them, George said quietly. It doesn't mean anything when they're willing to lie to their wives to do it. Patricia nodded grimly. A man who'll cheat with you will cheat on you, Margaret. That's been true since the beginning of time. Margaret looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. The dawning realization that she'd made a terrible mistake. Thomas, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, we can fix this. We can go home and pretend this never happened. I'll call David and tell him it's over. I stared at this woman I'd been married to for 15 years, this woman who had just publicly humiliated me and planned to leave me for another man, and I felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, not even pity. Just a vast, empty calm. No, I said simply. What do you mean, no? I mean, no, we can't fix this. No, we can't pretend it never happened. And no, I don't want you to call David and tell him anything. This marriage is over, Margaret. Her face went through a series of emotions: disbelief, anger, panic, and finally a kind of desperate bargaining. You can't mean that. We've been together for 15 years. I made a mistake, but people make mistakes. We can go to counseling. We can work through this. You didn't make a mistake, I said, my voice steady and calm. You made a choice. You chose David over me. You chose to humiliate me in public. You chose to plan the end of our marriage without even telling me. Those weren't mistakes, Margaret. They were decisions. But I choose you now, she said desperately. David's gone, so I choose you. The words hit me like a physical blow. Not because they hurt, but because they revealed the depth of her selfishness so completely. Even now, even in her apology, she was making it clear that I was her second choice. Her consolation prize. That's the problem, I said quietly. You're only choosing me because David didn't choose you, and I'm done being anyone's second choice. Margaret looked around the group of family members, searching for someone who would take her side, who would tell me I was being unreasonable, but she found only silence and disappointed faces. You're all going to regret this, she said finally, her voice taking on a bitter edge. When David comes back to me, when he realizes what he's lost, you're all going to feel very foolish. Margaret, Sarah said sadly, David isn't coming back, and even if he did, look what you've lost in trying to get him. Look what you've destroyed. Margaret gathered her purse and what remained of her dignity, shooting me one last look that was equal parts hatred and desperation. This isn't over, Thomas. You may think you've won, but this isn't over. She walked away then, her heels clicking on the stone path as she made her way toward the parking lot. I watched her go, this woman who had been the center of my world for 15 years, and felt only relief. Patricia put her hand on my arm. You did the right thing, Thomas. It took courage to expose the truth, and it's taking even more courage to walk away. Helen nodded, tears in her eyes. I'm so sorry, Thomas. I'm sorry for what she did to you, and I'm sorry for what she's put this family through. She's still your daughter, I said gently. Don't lose her completely because of this. She's lost herself, Helen replied sadly. We'll always love her, but we can't enable her anymore. What she did today, it showed us who she really is. Sarah wiped her eyes and looked around at the scattered wedding guests. I should probably try to salvage what's left of my reception. Your marriage is what matters, I told her, not the party. And your marriage is beautiful, Sarah. Don't let what happened here take that away from you. She squeezed my hand gratefully, then went to find Robert and begin the process of turning their wedding day back into a celebration. I stood there for a moment longer, watching the sun set over the country club gardens, and realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't dreading going home. Because I wasn't going home to Margaret anymore. I was just going home. 3 months after the wedding, I was sitting in my lawyer's office signing the final divorce papers when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me look. Thomas, this is Elena Patterson. I hope you don't mind me reaching out. I got your number from the phone records when I was going through David's things. I wanted to thank you for what you did at the wedding. It saved me from wasting any more years on a lie. I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, How are you doing? Her response came quickly. Better than I expected. Angry, but better. How are you? Free, I typed, and realized it was the truest thing I'd written in years. The divorce had been surprisingly straightforward. Margaret had tried to fight it at first, claiming temporary insanity and demanding half of everything I'd worked for over the past 15 years. But when her lawyer heard the recordings and learned about the planned affair, even he advised her to take what I was offering and walk away quietly. She'd moved in with her mother temporarily, which had lasted exactly 3 weeks before Helen told her she needed to find her own place. Margaret had rented a small apartment across town, and according to Sarah, she was working as a receptionist at a dental office. The woman who'd once looked down on me for being boring was now answering phones and scheduling appointments for $8 an hour. David, I'd learned through mutual acquaintances, had fared even worse. Elena had filed for divorce immediately and taken him for everything she could legally claim. His business had suffered when word got around about his behavior. Apparently, cheating on your wife didn't inspire confidence in your professional integrity. Last I'd heard, he was living in a studio apartment and driving for a rideshare company to make ends meet. I felt no satisfaction in their downfall. I hadn't orchestrated their destruction. I'd simply revealed the truth they'd been hiding. What happened after that was the natural consequence of their own choices. My phone buzzed again. Elena. Would you like to get coffee sometime? I know this might sound strange, but I feel like you're the only person who truly understands what I went through. I considered the invitation. Elena seemed like a genuinely kind person who'd been hurt by the same selfishness that had nearly destroyed me. But I wasn't ready for any kind of relationship, even a friendship born from shared trauma. I'd like that, I typed back, but can we wait a few months? I'm still figuring out who I am without Margaret. Of course. Take all the time you need. The offer stands whenever you're ready. I set my phone down and looked around my new apartment. It was smaller than the house Margaret and I had shared, but it was mine. Every piece of furniture, every book on the shelves, every picture on the walls, it all reflected my taste, my interests, my life. For the first time in 15 years, I was living for myself. The apartment was in a nice complex with a pool and a gym, amenities I'd never bothered with when I was married. Now I swam laps every morning before work, something that helped clear my head and strengthen my body. I'd lost 20 pounds since the divorce, not from stress, but from finally taking care of myself. Work had become more enjoyable too. As an accountant for a mid-sized firm, I'd always been competent, but never particularly ambitious. Margaret had always made me feel like my job was boring, like I should be doing something more exciting, more prestigious. Now I realized I actually enjoyed the precision and logic of numbers, the satisfaction of helping small businesses organize their finances and plan for growth. My boss had even hinted at a promotion, saying my work had become noticeably sharper and more creative over the past few months. Apparently, not having someone constantly undermining your confidence makes you better at your job. Who would have thought? I'd also reconnected with old friends that Margaret had gradually pushed out of our lives. Jim from college, who she'd said was too loud and crude for dinner parties. Mike from my old neighborhood, who she'd claimed was beneath us socially. These men welcomed me back with open arms, and I realized how much I'd missed having people in my life who actually enjoyed my company. We'd started a poker game that met every Thursday night, rotating between apartments. It was nothing fancy, $5 buy-in, cheap beer, and conversations that ranged from sports to politics to the peculiarities of middle-aged dating. Margaret would have hated everything about it, which made me love it even more. Last Thursday, Jim had asked me if I was seeing anyone yet. Not interested. I'd told him honestly, I'm still learning how to be single. Good for you, Mike had said, dealing the next hand. Take your time. The right woman will appreciate a man who knows who he is. I'd thought about that comment a lot since then. For 15 years I'd been whoever Margaret needed me to be. The steady provider, the reliable husband, the man who didn't complain when he was taken for granted. I'd lost track of who Thomas actually was underneath all those roles. Slowly, I was figuring it out. I liked jazz music, which Margaret had always said was pretentious. I enjoyed cooking, something she'd never let me do because she insisted on controlling the kitchen. I was actually pretty funny when I wasn't constantly worried about saying the wrong thing and setting off one of her moods. I'd even started dating, though nothing serious. A few dinners with women I'd met through work or friends, a couple of coffee dates arranged through online apps. Nothing had developed into a relationship, but that was fine with me. I was enjoying the process of getting to know new people without the pressure of trying to make anyone happy but myself. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. I opened it to find a delivery man holding a large envelope. Thomas Mitchell? That's me. Certified letter. I signed for it, wondering what official business could be reaching me on a Saturday afternoon. The return address made my stomach clench. Margaret's lawyer's office. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief message. Margaret Holloway requests a meeting to discuss reconciliation. She has asked me to convey that she has ended all contact with David Patterson and is prepared to commit fully to rebuilding your marriage. Please contact this office to arrange a meeting if you are interested. I read the letter twice, then walked to my kitchen and fed it into the garbage disposal. Margaret calling her lawyer to request reconciliation was the most Margaret thing imaginable, formal, manipulative, and completely missing the point. She still thought this was about David, that if she could prove she'd given him up, I'd take her back. She didn't understand that David had never been the real problem. The problem was her complete inability to see me as anything more than a convenience, her casual cruelty, her assumption that I would always be there no matter how badly she treated me. My phone rang. Sarah. "Thomas, I'm so sorry," she said without preamble. "Margaret made me give her your new address. She said she needed to send you something important through her lawyer." "It's okay, Sarah. I got the letter." Are you going to meet with her?" I could hear the hope in Sarah's voice. Despite everything, she still loved her sister and probably held out hope that we could work things out. "No," I said gently. "That part of my life is over." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "She's not doing well, Thomas. She lost her job at the dental office because she kept calling in sick. Mom's worried about her." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I meant it. "But Margaret's well-being isn't my responsibility anymore." "I know. I guess I hoped that maybe." "Sarah, would you want Robert to take you back if you cheated on him? If you publicly humiliated him and planned to leave him for another man?" "No," she admitted quietly. "I guess I wouldn't. Margaret made her choices. I'm making mine." After I hung up, I walked out onto my balcony with a cup of coffee and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The view from my apartment wasn't as nice as the one from the house I'd shared with Margaret, but it was mine. Every element of my life now was mine, chosen by me, for me, without having to consider anyone else's approval or disapproval. My phone buzzed one more time. This time, it was a text from my friend Jim. "Poker game moved to 7 tonight instead of 8. Mike's bringing his famous chili. You in?" I smiled and typed back, "Absolutely. I'll bring beer." Then I got dressed, grabbed my keys, and headed out to spend an evening with people who actually enjoyed my company. As I walked to my car, I realized something that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. I was genuinely happy. Not the desperate, anxious happiness of someone trying to please an impossible partner, but the deep, quiet contentment of a man who was exactly where he belonged. Margaret had spent 15 years trying to change me into someone more exciting, more sophisticated, more like David. She'd never understood that the man I was, steady, loyal, kind, was enough, more than enough. Now I knew it too. As I drove through the Saturday evening traffic toward an apartment full of friends and laughter, I thought about Elena's text from earlier. Maybe in a few months, when I was even more settled in this new life, I'd take her up on that coffee offer. Not because I was looking for romance, but because she was someone who understood the value of honesty, the importance of loyalty, the difference between love and manipulation. But for now, I was content to be alone. For the first time in my adult life, I was living for myself, making decisions based on what I wanted, rather than what someone else expected from me. Margaret had given me an unexpected gift when she chose David over me. She'd forced me to discover that I didn't need her approval to have value, didn't need her love to be worthy of love, and didn't need her presence to be happy. I was 62 years old, and I was finally free. And that freedom was worth more than any marriage built on lies, manipulation, and one-sided sacrifice. As I pulled into Mike's driveway, I could hear laughter coming from inside the apartment. My friends, real friends who liked me as I was, were waiting for me. I grabbed the beer from my passenger seat and headed toward the door, toward an evening of genuine companionship, toward a life that was authentically mine. Behind me, the sun finished setting on the longest, most difficult, and ultimately most liberating day of my life.